Hi guys, in this video we are going to analyze the poem The Charge of the Light Brigade. And the first thing we need to understand is a little bit about the context. So we know that Tennyson was Poet Laureate, which means that he was appointed by the royal household to write poems about special occasions and events. So he wrote this poem as a tribute to British soldiers who died in the Crimean War. So that's the main contextual point that you need to know. And the next thing that we need to look at is the form of this poem. So as you can see, I've written the form right here, and it says it's written in the third person. And overall, this poem has a lack of rhyme, which could hint at the chaos of war. So that is the form of this poem. Now the next thing we look at are the attitudes that are in the poem. Now the main attitudes that are in this poem are admiration, patriotism, and horror. And we can zoom in on these while we're annotating and while reading the poem because they're the most common attitudes that come up. And the final thing we look at is a link to other poems. So here is a list of the potential poems you can link to. So we know that this poem is about war, and the best ones to link Charge of the Light Brigade with is Remains, War Photographer, Poppies, and Kamikaze. Now remember, you can always link to any poem, but it all depends on what the question is asking you. So in terms of war, we can link all these poems. Okay, now we're gonna start the analysis. However, first we're going to go through a quick summary of what actually happens in the poem. So, the poem describes a disastrous battle between the British cavalry and Russian forces. The Light Brigade are ordered to go into the valley and they're surrounded by enemy soldiers. And the British cavalry only have swords against the Russian soldiers who have guns. And in the end of the poem, we find out that the Light Brigade is defenseless and many of them are killed. So that was just a quick overview just before we start analysing, so we understand the poem. If you want the summary and the context in more detail, I will put the links in the description below, so you go ahead and watch those if you need to. So the first quote we're going to look at is here. So the quote says, half a league, half a league, half a league, onward. Now this is repetition, and it's creating a rhythm, and if you think about it, it sounds like the galloping of horses. Now, the other explanation we can get out of this quote is, as we know, the writer, so Tennyson, grew up on a farm. So this may be his unit of measurement. So a league is a unit of measurement. So half a league, half a league, half a league. It's repetition and it's a type of measurement. So this might be his way of measuring distance. So that is the first quote that I have looked at. And the second quote is at the end of the first stanza. So rode the 600. Now this is a repeated motif, and it is constantly presented throughout the poem. So it's constantly written at the end of each stanza. Most of the stanzas, the first three actually. But it's always rode the 600, and then not the 600, left the 600, noble 600. So 600, that phrase is constantly used. So it's a repeated motif here. And it is presented throughout with one purpose. So unity. So it's highlighting the unity of the British cavalry who are going into this valley with only swords against the guns of the Russian soldiers. So there we have our second quote. And just remember that in this poem, we're looking at how the British cavalry is going into, so they're not fully prepared. Their generals have sent them by mistake. And it's all about how they're sticking together as one, which makes them noble and they're praised for it. So this repeated motif is constantly implemented, is constantly used to show how they're always one, even if they don't have a chance. So now we're going to move on to the next quote. I've highlighted 3 lines of this stanza, but you can use all of this so we can see that there's repetition here of theirs. And it portrays, so theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. So it's portraying the obedience of the soldiers. So they had to do and die, so they had to die, they had no choice. So again, just to further emphasize this point, even the next line, it's saying into the valley of death. So it's symbolizing their inevitable death. So they had to die, they had no other choice. Again, notice how there's here again, rode the 600. Yeah? And just remember that valley of death is a metaphor. That's the language feature. And that, so this whole stanza here, so these quotes here, theirs, and valley of death, so repetition, and the metaphor is all portraying that they have to die. So there's no other choice. Just see that there. And also, so now we're going to look at the next quote. And the next quote is in the next stanza. Now, it says jaws of death. We can also look at the underneath one, mouth of hell. Now, these are both metaphors, and they are emphasizing how the soldiers, the British cavalry, are surrounded by death. There's no escape, and it's highlighting their bravery, that they're still there as one, trying to fight in that war, trying to fight, and you know what? They have to stay together to beat the opposition because they have no chance. But even before I try and analyze that, if we look here, there's repetition of cannon, cannon, cannon. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. So they are really truly surrounded by death. And these metaphors at the end of the stanza further emphasize. So at the beginning of the stanza, they are surrounded. But at the end, they're being engulfed by that violence, and death is basically that is inevitable. So they're going to die. They're surrounded by it. So again, if we look at the bottom, it's ending in rode the 600. So here is again with the repeated motif, which is presented throughout the poem with only one purpose, and that is to show their unity. So even if they're surrounded, even if they know that they're going to die, they're still one unit. They're one unity. They are together. So these are all quite key quotes. We can link them all together as well in one paragraph. Now the next quote is here. So it's in the last stanza, and we're looking at the repetition of honor. And this links into the attitude of admiration. And it symbolizes presenting the men as heroes. So the men had a duty, and even in pain, they fulfilled their duty, and now they're seen as heroes. So this repetition is emphasizing how admiring and how amazing these men were, who knew they had no chance, but they still fought for their country. So patriotism as well. So 2 of the attitudes are shown at the end, so admiration and patriotism. Throughout the whole poem, there's a lot of horror. So the attitude of horror is shown throughout the whole poem when they're surrounded by the jaws of death, the mouth of hell, the cannons all around them. So that's the horror. The patriotism is also shown throughout. As they're fighting for their country, even in pain, they're fulfilling their duty. So even at the end, there's lots of patriotism, and now there's admiration. The final quote here is the very last line. And this is very key because, again, there's a motif of the 600. So rode the 600 is repeated 3 times in the first 3 stanzas. And then we've got not the 600, left the 600, and noble 600. So it's always 600. They're like unified. So it's symbolism of their unity, their bravery, and their valiance, and they are praised for sacrificing themselves. So that is the importance of the very last line. We need to remember how the 600 stayed as one. They were in perfect unity, they were brave, they were valiant, they sacrificed themselves for their country. So again, there's an attitude of patriotism and admiration. The horror has gone now, but it was at the beginning of the poem quite a lot. Yep. So that was the poem Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. If you like this video, hit the subscribe button. Thank you very much for watching.